Good afternoon and welcome to the ISN New Jersey webinar series. Our topic for today's program is on supplier diversity, which is definitely a hot topic. During the program, please make sure to use the Q&A or the chat buttons at the bottom for any questions you may have for our speakers today. At this point, I would like to turn over the program to John Sepcie and Daylen Chambliss from Corcentric, who are our featured speakers for today.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. I'm going to be sharing my screen in just a second. If you don't mind giving me a second here. Zoom is always fun to be working with. So yeah, okay, are we sharing here? Yes, we are. All right. Great, so yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. Like Kathy said, my name is John Sepcie. I'm joined today with my colleague Daylen Chambliss. We're from Corcentric, and we're part of Corcentric's advisory team, so specifically focused on procurement transformations, AP transformations, things like that. As we all trickle in, we just have a couple stats up on the screen, so feel free to take a peek. We're just wanted to display a couple stats to get us all thinking as we're working through this presentation, and just keeping in mind the current state of supplier diversity. So with that said, we'll move it into some of those intros. And just so everyone knows, we will be sharing this deck. So you will have access to everything that we're going to discuss today, and you can review at your own leisure. So like I said, my name's John Sepcie. That's my pretty mug right there on the screen. So I've been with Corcentric almost 2 years now. Prior to that, had a background in supplier contracts. So while I've been with Corcentric, we've helped build our supplier diversity consultancy services. So I've been the co-lead for that, and I've also helped build our change management practice. So along with Daylen and my colleague, a couple of my other colleagues, were very happy and proud about that. So with that said, Daylen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So good afternoon, everybody. As John mentioned, my name is Daylen Chambliss, and I am from the Corcentric Chicago office. So I've been with Corcentric for about 2 years, but have a history in customer service management. But while I've been with Corcentric, I've essentially helped to co-lead the process development initiative, where essentially we take a look at clients' processes and see how that best aligns to technology. So with that being said, we can move on into the agenda here. So a few topics today that we'll be covering. So the first being, what is supplier diversity? Giving kind of a holistic definition of what supplier diversity means and what it means to the overall market. Then we'll take a look at what building a supplier diversity program looks like, and just some basic steps that you can use to build out that program in your own organization. We'll take a look at why supplier diversity is becoming a very important thing to consider when building out programs. We'll take a look at building out a supplier diversity program a little bit more in detail, and then take a look at supplier development as well.
So before we really dig into it, we wanted to take a, just step back and take a look at what supplier diversity is. So regardless whether you have a background in supplier diversity or you're familiar with it or not, it's something that's really affecting all of us in the current state of business. So really how our team defines a supplier diversity program and supplier diversity as a whole, it's really a proactive business decision designed to encourage the use of diverse suppliers. So depending on what your organization defines as diverse, it can vary from organization to organization. And we do have a little call out that international requirements would vary as well. So when you get into larger programs, you would run into that. But for today's purposes, we're going to focus really on a domestic program. So that can be anybody from a minority-owned business, a woman-owned business, veteran or LGBTQ. Typically, we're looking at less represented suppliers. So in some instances, in some programs, that could even be small businesses that would fall under that certification. So with that said, there's a couple different national organizations that tend to be some of the premier certification councils, we'll call them. So we really wanted to just highlight a couple of these right here. And when we get a little bit more into the presentation, we'll discuss how some of the benefits of these councils, aside from just certifying different suppliers, we think that they offer a lot from for the suppliers themselves, but also for individuals and organizations looking to build out a program. So when we start to build a program, typically what we like to see is a couple things. We like to see policy. We like to see a process, goals, metrics, things like that. But really what we like to stress is that it's an iterative and adaptive program and things like that. There's nothing that you're going to do on day one that's going to really you're not going to stick with anything you do on day one. You're going to evolve and you're going to adapt. And as you develop your program a little bit more, you're going to see that that program might be able to offer different benefits, or you're going to serve different purposes. So when you're building out policy, that's really going to be your governing document. That's where you're going to put your definitions, things like that, and you're going to define what would eventually become your process. So after you've established how you want this program to look and you've established what the process would be, you need to establish some of your goals, metrics, and your benchmarks. And when I say benchmarks, I mean taking a look at your current supply base and maybe expanding that, and taking a look and kind of filtering and taking a look at what is diverse, who is diverse, and kind of just building on that. By setting these goals, you're going to basically be setting the actual numbers that you can track, whether that be we'll actually get a little bit more into the metrics a little bit later, but after we've built those metrics and those benchmarks, you want to figure out how you're going to go about certifying these suppliers, whether you're going to offer a self-certification program, which some might, you might build into a sponsorship program. So taking these suppliers who aren't currently certified with an organization and helping them work through it and getting them through the certification process. But really, I call out supplier onboarding here because what we recommend is the onboarding process is the most important time to really gather the information that you're going to use to build those metrics and establish those benchmarks. And that's where it leads into the reporting and the updates. So after you're constantly reporting on this, you're tracking your metrics, you're going to make updates to your program. So if you see that year one, you've had a really successful year and you want to expand and maybe set new goals, that would be the time to do it. So really all of these things encompass what would be, or what we would typically like to see in a program. So before we move into what we're calling some of the benefits of supplier diversity, Daylen, I just wanted to check and see if there's any questions in the chat or see if we had anything come through just yet.
Nope, nothing yet.
All right, great. And yeah, feel free to just use the chat function and we'll take a pause whenever we can to really answer and address any of those questions. So with that said, Daylen, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So when we begin talking about supplier diversity, one of the questions that comes up frequently is, what are the benefits? So what value does it bring to my organization and to me specifically when we're starting to build out these programs? So like John mentioned, a lot of supplier diversity programs can vary in size and scope. So the benefits can really change there depending on how big the program is, how many people you have as resources. But what we've essentially seen across the board are these four main benefits here that I'll go into in a little bit more detail. So the first one here is an increased supplier pool. So really when you adopt a diversity policy, you're making a decision to create more opportunities for suppliers that encourages growth and diverse businesses. So in addition to that growth, you're also encouraging and promoting the addition of more innovative companies through the introduction of new products, services, and solutions when you form relationships with diverse suppliers. So one thing we've really seen in the market is that diverse suppliers are really kind of thinking outside the box and coming up with new and unique ways to kind of compete with organizations that are more established in their respective industries. So taking on the next step here would be an improved corporate image. So when you have a comprehensive diversity program that you're building out, you're really positioning yourself as in your organization as a leader and for corporate and social responsibility, and then also further pushing the initiative to increase equity within the marketplace. The third benefit that we've identified is just regulatory compliance. So as supplier diversity and diversity programs gain more traction in the market, we're starting to see a lot of organizations kind of build out corporate mandates that require clients to have developed diversity programs in order to do business. And in addition to that, we're seeing that a lot of diversity programs that help with compliance, either with federal equal opportunity initiatives or also other government regulations that require organizations to have diverse programs. So the last one here that we have is supplier consolidation. So with an effective program that you have built out, you can really identify diverse suppliers that may have potentially had a spectrum of services and goods that you initially may have used from a larger selection of incumbent suppliers. So it's a good idea when you have a program that if you're identifying suppliers that can maybe provide or produce more goods and services than the original incumbent suppliers that you had that had initially a larger supplier base, it's good to consolidate those services into one. So with that being said, we can move to the next one. So these are just four main fundamental steps that we've kind of built out when building out a program for building a supplier diversity program. So as we had mentioned before, a lot of these can differ and change depending on the scope and size of your project, but these four main ones we've seen are really good things that you should consider when building out the program. So we have here assessing the current state, defining the program, developing program governance, and then implementing and program management. So when we talk about assessing the current state, that really just means setting and establishing the baseline. So taking a look at your current suppliers, identifying any suppliers that are already diverse suppliers in your supplier base, and then also just kind of determining the scope of the diversity. So what are you personally defining as diverse suppliers, and how do you want to reach out and create a relationship and engagement with those diverse suppliers? And then a part of that also comes to evaluating the technology needs. So for example, let's say you have an RFP or a requirement for RFPs, that any RFP that goes out to the market, you want to have at least one diverse supplier on that RFP. So taking a look and evaluating if you have the technology to really enforce those requirements and regulations that you want to build out for your design. So once we assess the current state of the program, we really want to make some definitions and define the program. And that basically means developing a governance model, and a roadmap around building out the project and seeing it to conclusion. Also examining existing client measures and programs that you have already built out in your organization. And then in addition to that, designing some sort of outreach strategy. So both internal and external, how you're kind of outreaching, how are you bringing outreach to the program internally with enabling stakeholders to buy into what you'd like to have done, and then externally, how are you for external suppliers, how are you reaching out to the suppliers so they can be added and to your program? So the third item here is developing program governance. So that's really just creating and making sure that you have policies and procedures defined in your program, and then defining reporting mechanisms and making sure that any dashboards or type of reporting that you use can be sent out to the respective parties to make sure that your program, once it is complete, really can lead towards success. And then in addition, engaging, if necessary, third parties for extended network development. Oftentimes we're seeing that a lot of programs don't necessarily have the resources to be really built out on their own. So it's also always a good idea to just take a look at any third-party services or third-party clients that you can work with that can help kind of lead the lead work in building out and engaging with external suppliers, and essentially just building out those program governance and regulations. And then the last one we have here is the implementation and the program management. So making sure that you have a detailed project plan with set milestones and a communication plan on how you're going to convey those internal milestones with either stakeholders of your organization or just the general organization in general. And then as well as that, incorporating programs and program-specific metrics into sourcing events and regulations. So once you have the program built out, how are you incorporating that into the procurement regulations or procurement processes that you already have in place in your organization? And then at the end of that comes training your diverse suppliers. So how are you providing an outreach program to your suppliers? How are those suppliers reaching out to you to be onboarded, and what training, if anything, they need to have to make sure that those suppliers can work efficiently with your team? Right. So when we talk about building out a policy, we really want to make sure that we have these four main items here. So a policy should really include your clearly stated goals and objectives. So what do you want to see? What is the value that you want to see out of this program? And what are the business objectives that you want to have set? And we always want to make sure that those are trackable and those are measurable. So once the project is implemented, we can track that throughout the life cycle of that program, just to make sure that we're hitting the marks and we're hitting all of the metrics that we need to be successful in that project. In addition to that, just setting definitions. So what does your organization consider a diverse supplier? How are you reaching out to those suppliers? And just setting some goals and definitions on how you're reaching out and engaging with those suppliers that you're building a project around. In addition to that, it's the governance. So setting out a clear, defined policy, making sure that those policies are detailed and descriptive, and make sure that they really align with all other aspects of your organization to make those are as acceptable as possible. And then where's that policy located once you build that out? So we always want to make sure that we have both an internal and external policy, which I'll get into a little bit more, just making sure that once we have those policies and procedures aligned and documented, that we have spaces where those can be reviewed and accessed by the parties that need to see that. That being said, great, thanks, John. So as I mentioned, when we're talking about a diversity policy, it's best to have an internal and an external policy. So the internal policy should really be more focused around procurement specific policies. So just making sure that any of the policies that you have are really aligned to any existing procurement rules and regulations that you have to make sure that those are working in ultimate harmony. And then also making sure that that's detailed and prescriptive. So making sure that any policies that you're building out are really defined and explicit, just to make sure that everyone who needs to follow these rules has full understanding of what the policy should be. And then, as mentioned before, just building out a governance structure, making sure that we have that documented and those regulations and rules are as clear and precise as possible. And then when we talk about an external policy, that can be a little bit more high level, essentially just giving a basic overview of the goals and the value of the policy or the supplier diversity program that you're building out. So this is a really good opportunity here to see if this can align to your overall mission statement for your organization and have that come full circle back. So in addition to that, the external diversity policy should also have any steps or process procedures for open registration. So if there's any access for suppliers to register and be on board, that should be clearly stated in that external policy. And then also links to relevant web pages, to a procurement or an AP page that just give external suppliers just a good understanding of how those policies and procedures work within their own internal organization.
Great. So after you've built out your policy, it might be a great opportunity then to start building out some of that baseline information. So as part of your first steps, what you really want to do is kind of establish those baselines. So take a look at your current supplier database, just as it is, just as an open supplier pool. And then from there, you might want to take a look at what you define as your diverse qualifications. So not necessarily saying what you define as a diverse supplier, but what type of qualifications and requirements do you actually need to certify them as a diverse supplier with your organization? Like I mentioned earlier, it could be a self-certification thing, a sponsorship program, or just presenting some membership to some of those certifying orgs that we talked about earlier. And then also you kind of want to build your diverse supplier database. So after you've established your holistic supplier database, you want to see if you have that filtering capability to establish your diverse suppliers. So you want to see what percentage that is. This is where we get into some of those measurables that Daylen mentioned before. And this is going to be what you're going to use to track some of those metrics. So you can take a look at where you started at the beginning of the program with your baselines and move forward from there. So after you have your baseline, you can set your program goals. And this is more so specific goals. This wouldn't necessarily be the high level goals that Daylen mentioned earlier, but specifically how you want to build out a new supplier database. What type of requirements do you want to have? Do you want to have in there the filtering capability based on last year's spend, based on forecasted things like that? So using that tech piece of it to kind of build upon your current program. What we always try to advocate for is working smarter, not harder. So taking any type of current tech that you may have, whether that be an ERP system, PeopleSoft, something like that, and trying to make it work for your program. And then from there, you want to set, after you've set those diverse qualifications, you really want to start implementing. So you've established what you need to certify somebody as a diverse supplier. You want to start finding ways to enforce them. And that was where you would look up to your policy or your process that you have defined to really make sure that you're abiding by those rules. And then after you've started to build your program and you've established you've had either some success or not the success that you would hope for, you want to start building up that and updating that diverse supplier database. So take a look at where you started and starting to track how you're building upon that. And then that's going to inform some of your decisions that you make after you've seen how the program works for a little bit. And then the last thing that we like to advocate for is really reporting and using that data enrichment. So We'll get a little bit more detail in the next slide what third-party data enrichment would be, but really you're comparing your database or your information, any type of the way you qualify your suppliers, and you're going to compare it to somebody else's database. So you're going to have this constant updated database based on your information and this third party's data information. So really what we see here is a lot of third party data enrichment. What they do is they have membership to these diverse supplier organizations. So these certifying orgs. So you have more than just we can check off if they're in the box or if they are diverse. What you really have is now a supplier identification tool. So you can use that as a way to search for new suppliers. You can filter it in different ways. But really, you have access to some of those diverse organizations. You get access to some maybe trade shows or things like that, something to where you can help identify diverse suppliers on your own and build upon what the third party is offering you and start to expand your own capabilities. Now, when we talk about third-party data enrichment, what we really mean here is that third-party vendor who's going to supply you with an accurate, diverse supplier database. And what they're doing is they're constantly verifying and validating any contact information, certification status, what the company profile looks like. So really what you're gaining here is some insights into the market, really, by just comparing what you have and seeing, and like I mentioned before, with that supplier identification tool, you're growing your existing database with this third party. So you're constantly running this information against one another, but you really have the ability to filter, to search. And I think that's where I really stress, not necessarily the importance, but the benefit of third-party data enrichment. There's a couple different specific third parties who do this type of work. And with a little bit of research, and if you send me a note after the presentation, I can point some people in that direction. But really, these are a very niche service provider, really. So I can't stress enough how valuable some of their insights would be for a growing program or a growing policy that you're trying to build out. So with this third-party data enrichment, you can monitor your existing suppliers, you can grow your diverse supplier database, and you have access to those organizations. So really, you're creating a holistic program by establishing your own requirements, your own process, your own informed decisions, and then you can also validate it with this third-party organization. So you're not just stuck in your own silo of building your program alone anymore, and that's what I like to stress with some of this third-party data enrichment and some of the benefits it may offer. So, Daylen, if you wouldn't mind just walking us through how you can fit supplier diversity policy and programs into your existing procurement program.
Definitely, but before that, it looks like we do have one question in the Q&A section. Looks like it's from James. He asked, can you recommend resources to identify diverse suppliers? So actually at the end of this slide, we do provide a slide deck. We do provide a list of organizations that do grant certification status for different diverse criteria. So we'll be sending this slide deck out at the end of this call, so you'll be able to take a look at that.
Sure, and Daylen, right there, without necessarily plugging specific organizations on this webinar here, feel free to send us an email after the fact, and we can put together some information on different third-party data enrichers as well. I like to just highlight their supplier identification tool capabilities as well. So feel free to reach out after the presentation. Thank you, Daylen.
Great. Yeah. So when we talk about diversity, supplier diversity, and then how it integrates and intersects with procurement, one thing that we really want to make sure is that when we're building out those supplier diversity programs, that they're aligned with any existing rules and policies that we have built out for the procurement department. So one thing we want to make sure of is that we're really taking a step back and looking and existing and evaluating all of the existing procurement policies. So that just means any standard procedures and process that your organization has for procuring items, and any requirements and due diligence that you have set up already just for procurement and procuring and accessing and sourcing new items. So first taking a look at what currently exists and then seeing how we can align and build out our specific diversity policies. So when we take a look at and talk about the diversity policies, one thing that we really want to make sure of is the program goals. So what are the goals that we expect to have achieved here? What's the overall outcome? And what are the requirements that we need to have set up just to make sure everyone can follow what needs to happen to make sure that this program is successful? Then once we have that set up, we really want to establish the when, where, and how. So when are we going to be engaging and reaching out to diverse suppliers? Where is this engagement going to happen? And how are we going to be tracking and measuring that success when we are working with those diverse suppliers? So once we have that built out, we really want to make sure that we're taking a look at the new requirements or any requirements that might need to be added on to existing procurement policies. So what new diversity requirements exist within existing procedures that we already have built out? And are there any exceptions or any exclusions that we need to make to those procedures to make sure that the policies are being adhered to? John, if you could move to the next section. Great. So in terms of metrics and reporting, supplier diversity is no different from any other program that you're building out. So in terms of reporting, we really push for frequent reporting, as that's vital for any successful program. So really, once you determine which metrics and benchmarks are the most important to your organization, you're really going to set a schedule for the cadence and how frequently you need to review those metrics. So for example, if you have a program where you set and establish multi-year goals for your organization, you're going to be wanting to check that on a monthly and even maybe bi-weekly schedule, just to make sure that you're assessing any areas where you might need to improve your program and your processes. So one thing also to consider is that different metrics may be more valuable to different organizations. So you're really going to want to step back and revisit your outcomes and your business requirements and just determine what are the specific metrics that really align to those outcomes. So for example, if you are a smaller organization, you might have a smaller supply base and you don't necessarily need to always go out to the market when finding new suppliers or new goods or new services. So you might want to shift your metrics to kind of taking a look at the current diverse supplier base that you have and seeing, how you can increase your spend with those suppliers. So in that case, you're going to want to track your total spend versus, how many suppliers that you have directly in your supplier base, or, your total percentage of diverse suppliers, and see how you can improve those metrics there. So it's really just kind of taking a step back and looking at what is most valuable to your organization and making sure that you have the appropriate metrics built around that. And lastly, you're going to want to make sure that you have the supplier diversity requirements kind of stemming from federal obligations, like if there's any financials obligations or any service industries that you need to track. So for example, if you want to track how often your diverse suppliers and how often diverse suppliers are down selected, you might want to need to define that a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, Daylen. So I want to take a step back before we take a look at this slide here. For what we have labeled as supplier development, I'm going to kind of encompass what would normally be two different topics. So for those of you familiar with diversity programs, I'm going to be talking here a little bit more about supplier development, but also tier 2 a little bit in this. In short, tier 2 is really just your suppliers. So tracking and monitoring some of those requirements that you may set for some of these vendors that you work with. But when we look at what supplier development really is, it's really a collaborative approach to working with your suppliers to really enrich their services and expand their scope for future projects. Or if we're going to look at it from a tier 2 perspective, it's identifying who might be great suppliers to start implementing a tier 2 program. So really your first step is going to be locating and targeting those specific suppliers. So really you want to take a look at who might be shining star examples. Maybe some of your preferred suppliers might be the suppliers that you might want to not necessarily test, but sandbox this a little bit, figure out what might work and what might not work for your program. After you've established those suppliers, you want to take a look at how often you're going to be meeting to discuss project goals, how often you are going to be collaborating with one another. Really, what is the goal of this development? Do you want to take a diverse supplier and maybe expand their reach and expand their scope to be offering services outside of your specific department and maybe expand it for an enterprise type organization, things like that. But really what you're doing here is you're meeting frequently to establish those goals and figure out what's going to be important and how you guys are going to go about actually implementing this development program. And then after you've kind of established what that looks like, you want to start benchmarking. You want to establish goals. You want to establish targetable and measurable goals. You want to establish where you want to be. So if you have set, you want to increase the spend, like Daylen mentioned in the last slide, you want to determine how often you're going to be doing that. And is that going to be benchmarked on a year-to-year basis or things like that? But really, what I like to recommend here is that this doesn't have to start after you've already contracted with a supplier. This is something that you can bring up from the beginning. You can start this during any negotiations. Be upfront about what your program looks like and be upfront about what's important to your organization, and potentially make this part of some contractual goals. If you want to have a tier 2 program built out, make some SLAs surrounding what that tier 2 program looks like. Are you going to require them to report monthly, every quarter, things like that? Put SLAs in your contracts to actually enforce that. And if not, there might be some actual legitimate physical consequences there. So that might mean a loss of income, or they might not get certain rebates, things like that. But don't be afraid to discuss this early on in any relationship. There's no reason why you can't be upfront from the very beginning and say, this is what's important and this is how we're going to do it. So all I can say is that developing a program, whether that be tier 2 or taking your existing diverse suppliers and building upon them, it's just all about communication and communicating what's important to you. And coming from a little bit of a change management background, sometimes that might be important as to who's sending it. If you find that you have a great relationship with one specific account manager or something like that, maybe recommend it to them. But it's all about having that open line of communication to say, this is what's working for us, this is where we want to improve, and allow the supplier to do the same. And I think some people would be surprised as far as what you can actually accomplish by having that open line of communication with diverse suppliers or new suppliers, things like that. Everyone's going to always be eager to please. So just take advantage of that when you can. And Daylen, would you mind talking to us a little bit about some common barriers we would see with not only supplier development, but a full supplier diversity program?
Sure. So a few common barriers that we've kind of seen across the realm of scopes of supplier diversity programs are the ones that we have here. So first one being supplier diversity programs are often overlooked. So, or a lot of times programs are seen as kind of a big value from the social aspect of things, but not really in terms of how this can actually benefit the company from a revenue perspective. So what you can do to really mitigate that is creating a business case. So kind of stepping back and building out a case for supplier diversity. And once you have that and kind of can show how it can increase the ROI, you can really come to the stakeholders or the people who have that decision-making power and really promote and communicate the value of supplier diversity. So it really comes down to creating that business case and creating and establishing those business outcomes that really resonate with the company and showing how a supplier diversity program can really address and tackle those. So in addition to that, we see a lot of times on the budgeting and resourcing side that far too many programs, especially in their infancy stages, far too many are under-resourced and just don't have the budgeting to really lead to success. So really what you can do there is just making sure before you start your program or even defining it, just making sure that you have in your plan some sort of budget that can be really leveraged across the entire program, just to make sure that you have what you need to make sure that program is a success. So that really ties back to creating a business case, because if you can create a business case that's really impactful, that will really get the buy-in from the stakeholders and the people with the decision-making power in your organization to provide maybe a bigger resource or a bigger budget to really make sure that that project can be a success. So in addition to that, we have here finding suppliers once your program is built out. So a lot of organizations build out their program, they hit the ground running, they're ready to talk to diverse suppliers. But one thing that we see is that often the suppliers that they find and that they work with don't necessarily have that same scale that they initially need. So it might be good at the beginning of the project, the diverse suppliers are able to provide the goods and services needed. But what we see a lot of times happening is if that project scales or the request for the goods and services scales, oftentimes suppliers do not have the bandwidth to be able to compete and keep up with that. So making sure that the suppliers that you're engaged with and working with, you have a good understanding of the size and scope of that supplier, and if there is any opportunity for scaling or increasing the engagement in the future, that the supplier is willing and able to do that, and that essentially make sure that there's no problems with the supplier providing what you need if that request becomes larger in the coming years or months for the supplier diversity program.
Do we have any questions in the chat right now, Daylen?
Yes, so we have one from David. So it says, for larger organizations that are not necessarily willing or able to, for whatever reason, publicly advertise opportunities, do you have any ideas on how to make diverse suppliers or certifying organizations aware of opportunities? So yeah, I can take this one. So one thing that's really good, and one thing that you can really kind of consider are third-party services that can provide assistance with building out a plan. So there's a lot of consulting and advisory services that essentially can help you build out your policies and procedures, and also can kind of go out into the market and find suppliers within your organization or industry to reach out to. So one way to leverage that is just making sure that you have a good understanding of what you need and what you want to build out, and speaking to those third-party service providers, and they can certainly assist you with building out what you would need and reaching out to those specific suppliers in the industry. And in addition to that, you can also go to trade shows. A lot of the organizations that will post and show at the end of this slide deck have conferences and shows. With COVID, it might be a little bit hard, but hopefully in the future, they'll have a lot of shows and trade shows where you can go in and express your interests and reach out to suppliers that way. So those are a few of the ways I think that you can reach out to suppliers without having it posted or expressed on a website or externally. So John, anything from your side?
No, that's great. And I know with some of the organizations, to your point about COVID, a lot of them are transitioning to virtual, and they're trying to get creative with how they go about what traditionally would be trade shows and meet and greets. So when we hand out the deck at the end of the presentation, I recommend taking a look at those organizations. I think that's a great piece of advice, Daylen. So kind of in line with some of that, as far as supplier outreach. So how are you going to identify those suppliers, but how are you also going to socialize your program? So when we talk about both an internal and external, for the sake of just clarity here, we mean internal. We mean your existing supplier base, I should say. But part of this also comes from socializing your policy with not only your existing suppliers, but also your organization. So they all understand where this need is coming from, and just encourage them to abide by the program. And that said, sometimes it's harder to enforce that, but really it's just putting emphasis on how important this is to your organization and finding ways to incentivize people. So, and that can go for your suppliers. So incentivizing ways for them to meet project goals and actively participate, whether that be building out your tier 2 program, or whether that be showcasing that you have the capabilities to provide or to scale up a little bit. So it's just ways to find within your existing supply base, finding ways to capitalize on what type of capabilities they have. You'd be surprised by asking. Sometimes they might have different capabilities than you knew about. So it's always good to socialize this internally. And like I mentioned before, those sponsorship programs to assist in the certification process. You might learn that you actually have diverse suppliers who aren't certified already, and it might just be a matter of helping guide them through that process. And whether you're outreaching to suppliers externally, outside of actually identifying suppliers in RFPs, what you can do is publish or announce your program. But to the question we got earlier, as far as David's question, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to do that. So it's just finding ways to incorporate within your existing procurement policies or your procurement practices in your RFPs. However you go about identifying diverse or existing suppliers, how you find about in RFPs, RFIs, it's maybe adding questions to ask if they have diverse suppliers within their existing base, and maybe networking a little bit. So it's trying to find ways to be creative if you can't publish it online. So, and if you can publish it online, we do recommend some type of way of having an online portal for you to submit, finding ways to actually make it easy for diverse suppliers to actually bid on projects and things like that. So if you have a portal, whether it be for consideration in the future, or you have an active like job board or job listing site, utilizing those to encourage the suppliers to make it an easy process, so they don't feel that they're not capable of providing the services, or that sometimes the RFP process can be too daunting that they don't have the resources to spend on that. So really kind of eliminating any bottlenecks that you might run into who would discourage smaller suppliers. So As I mentioned before, as far as supplier onboarding, I think that would be the time after you've already identified the suppliers, or you've down selected a supplier. Now is the time to get all of the information that you require. So that means finding ways to check off all the boxes on your due diligence. If you have certain requirements that you needed to check off, now would be the time to do it during your supplier onboarding, making sure you're capturing all of the requirements that you need, not for right now just to onboard, but to also certify them. So if you're having a sponsorship program, finding ways to make sure you're collecting that information. And to that point, the self-certifications and sponsorship programs, if you are going to sponsor a program or allow self-certifications, making sure you're very clear and explicit what you need from them to actually verify them and validate them as a diverse supplier. And to that last point, having an open registration portal and open opportunities board. This is beyond just the outreach, but you've already established that you require these certain documents or certifications or references. You can make that part of a requirement for that registration board. So when it is time to onboard, you already have that information. You identified this supplier through that open portal for a project that was 3 months after they submitted. You might have just saved some time on your RFP now because you don't have to go through some of this back and forth to collect that information. So with that said, I think this is what Daylen was alluding to earlier as far as the diversity certifications. These are just a few. We do recommend that people do a little bit of research on their own to see what might work. A lot of these different organizations actually have regional and local chapters as well. So the same way that we're in ISM New Jersey, the NMSDC might have a New Jersey chapter or a New Jersey branch. So it's always worth looking into these and then digging a little bit deeper, making a couple extra clicks to find where those regional or local organizations might be. And that might be where you can find diverse suppliers close to you, right within your own backyard or your own neighborhood. So with that said, we'd like to thank everyone for their time today. And I think we can open the floor for questions. I know we are pushing it a little bit, but feel free to email us any questions after the fact, Kathy. If you get any that come through, we're happy to answer them, anytime.
We did get one more. When bringing awareness of supplier diversity to senior leadership, how do we address concerns related to cost benefit and cost savings objectives can still be achieved? Business case build out justification for supporting program is key.
So I completely agree that when you're building out that business case, the justification is key. So a lot of the times that we recommend, and there are a lot of resources and white papers out there, but it's trying to find the way that you can demonstrate an ROI for this program. So what we would consider traditional ROI from a procurement perspective isn't going to necessarily apply to diversity, but it's finding ways to really encourage those senior leaders to get on board with the program, because this is what is not only innovative and it's that social responsibility, but it's also getting out ahead. A good example would be Daylen and I are working with a client right now who they're building out a diversity program solely because they want to be ahead of their competition. They want to be the ones who can justify saying that we can either build a tier 2 program and we have our own program that you can maybe model yourselves after. So it's just finding ways to speak to your senior leaders, I think is really the key of it. And I know there's a lot of nuance, and I don't want it to seem like it's a wishy-washy answer, but I think each organization might have their own nuances to that.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you both for such an informative presentation. Hopefully the audience was able to get some takeaways from today's presentation, especially about policies, metrics, and so forth. And did you have any last final comments before we conclude?
No, we just appreciate everyone's time. Daylen, if you wanted to send us off, feel free.
Yeah, I thank everyone for joining today. Hopefully you got something out of it. But as mentioned before, feel free to send us some emails if you have any additional questions, and we can certainly reach back out and provide what you need. But it's been a great experience here, and hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon.
Thank you. I did want to let everybody know that yes, we will be sending out the presentation, and we will also be posting the recording of this particular program. I will also be sending out a short survey, which will include the recording that I just spoke about, and also your CEC for today's program. I did want to mention next week on December 9th, we will be having a membership meeting, which all our ISM members are invited to attend as we discuss managing personnel working from home. followed by a half hour of networking. We hope you all had a great day, and thanks for joining us today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.